secular war history. But then when the pages got lost and he wasn't able to duplicate it, he decided to make it a religious one. And Von Brody, I remember her writing that was sort of a real fortunate thing, because that launched Joseph into the world of religion and church, because he had to rewrite the book after the pages got lost. And so he writes the book, he sells it, he tries to sell it, and then all of a sudden this church thing just sort of starts happening, and then it starts really snowballing because of his charisma and whatever teachings are in it. And then the way Grant Palmer tries to piece it together is by 1838, there's some huge, because of the Kirtland Bank scandal or whatever, there's some huge apostasy. Martin Harris gets up and says maybe we didn't ever touch or see the plates at all. And so he's trying to save the church from falling down. And so then he writes a version that's going to make it sound really authoritative, like God really called him to start the church. And so he then wrote the First Vision story then, and that's what stuck with us. That's a picture that's painted that, that sometimes has teeth for people who are trying to make sense of all this stuff.
Yeah.
What would your response to that depiction be?
Well, I think there are many sensible and reasonable people who would take that very seriously. We had a seminar, Grant Underwood and I ran a seminar on Joseph Smith for college teachers, non-Mormon college teachers. And they were very attracted to Grant Palmer's view of things, because it's the way historical critics of the Old and New Testament talk about the writing of things, that faith congeals over time. It doesn't just spring full-blown from anyone's mind. So I wouldn't say that it's dead wrong. What I would say is that there's a huge amount of conjecture involved in that. You're postulating a lot of things with very few points of evidence along the way. One of the things that Brody makes a lot of is that Joseph Smith was not religious, and she gets that from the Hurlbut affidavits, that they had no indication that Joseph was religious. But I don't see how that could be. First of all, he lives in a religious culture. It's just saturated with evangelical religion. And as soon as he tells his story of in 1832, and this is not long after, this is before the affidavits, man, he is involved in religion from the time he's 12 years old. This is a kid who has a private religious life. It's not evident, but he's really anguished about the state of his soul. He's worried about the existence of God. He's having to go through all the deistic arguments. So I don't like any history that assumes there was no religion in Joseph Smith's life. And then, to say, I think I'll write a book, I don't know, where does that come from? I'm going to write a book where it's translated from gold plates. It's so far from anything that's in his immediate environment. What you did, if you were a young kid wanting to make a career in religion, you became a preacher. That is the well-worn path. You go out and get a little congregation, and you preach to them, and then they begin to support you. And he does very little preaching, exhorts from the Methodists a little bit, but didn't win any followers as a preacher. So I would say, you really got to do a lot of contortions to make that story work.
Why was he doing anything for the Methodists if he had been told to start God's One True Church?
Well, why not do something for the Methodists? His wife's a Methodist, his brother-in-law's a Methodist. He's trying to make peace in the family. He doesn't know when he goes to the Methodist in the first place, the Methodist minister, he doesn't know whether to believe his own eyes. Can he believe that God has appeared to him? So he goes to the minister to try to figure out what's happened to him. And finally the minister, who dismisses it, persuades Joseph Smith that it wasn't true. He actually had seen things. So I don't think saying that it's his time to start a new church meant that he couldn't have anything to do with any other churches. He got very involved in the Masons when he got along. He welcomed all churches in the Nauvoo, let them preach there, and so on.
So that universalist background that maybe his father brought in was an important part of him.
Well, now when I say universalist, I don't mean universalism, the denomination and doctrine. I mean universalism in the sense that God reaches out to all people, as contrasted to particularistic.
Through all faiths and creeds in some way.
Yeah, right.
Okay. And just one last question on this point. Some would just say, now look, let's just really strip it down. When you see God in Jesus, that makes an impression on your mind. And so you're going to at least say who was in the room when you were having the vision. And so the 1832 version, there's no room for him not just saying who was in the room or who was in the forest at the time of the vision. Do you have any response to that?
Well, this is sort of, what do you think sort of thing.
Yeah.
Is it impossible for him to abbreviate his account by speaking to the Lord? Or, I mean, the God the Father just says one word to him, this is my beloved Son, and then Christ does all the other speaking. So, you might get excited about it, you might not.
Right. Okay. So at the end of the day, you just have to accept it on faith. Either he was a liar or he was, telling the truth. But you're also saying that it's reasonable, that it's not an open and shut case that there was deception or elaborate storytelling. That a reasonable person could conclude that the stories don't have to be inconsistent.
See, I go along this far with this line of thinking. That is, his purposes for writing the story did change as the years went by. And that affected the way he wrote the story. He's in a different position in 1838 than he is in 1832. He really is beginning to emerge as the founder of a church by 1838. There's been a lot of emphasis on loyalty to Joseph during those apostasy years. So his own self-conception is changing. And that's going to affect how he writes that story.
So he wasn't a strong figurehead leader in the church from 1830 to 1838? Like, I'm trying to understand exactly what his role was then, if it wasn't as a strong figurehead.
Well, I think he's a powerful figure. He's the one who speaks for God. And people almost immediately acknowledged he had that charismatic gift. Why they did that so fast, I don't know. But when he said, "Thus saith the Lord," they believed it from those very early years. So I'm not minimizing that. But I think the authority was in the gift rather than in the man. It was like the Irvingites in Britain. They would hear about people who had gifts, and they would go search the kingdom to find these people, and then just sort of listen to their gifts. But they're not interested in them as persons. They're just channels for the will of the Lord. And I think initially Joseph is kind of a channel. But as the years went by, he becomes more powerful as a person, and he creates this whole structure where he's the president of the high priesthood. He has all these bureaucratic roles, not just his charismatic roles. And all that made him a more prominent figure.
So what this strikes at is the perception that sometimes seems to be encouraged today, which is that the church is the same yesterday, today, and forever, that Adam and Eve were doing temple ceremonies just like we are now, that baptism is going on in the Old Testament times just like it is now, that everyone was not only plural married in the temple, but plural married, and that deacons were always 12 years old passing the sacrament with white bread. There's sort of this mentality today that I feel like comes out of CES, that everything is and always was as it is.
Yeah.
And it sounds like the church and our perceptions of the structure and the hierarchy and all this rigidity of what some would call a corporate church today wasn't anything like the 1830 to 1838 experience.
Well, I think that is true, that we do want to make the case that things have never been different. But the strange thing is that within our own culture, we always leave room for radical change because of the principle of revelation. Things are always the same. You only need one revelation, and then that's it. You just conform to it. It's only because conditions change and all transformations need to be made that you need revelation at all. So I think we've always prided ourselves on adaptations. And I personally think the point of a prophet is how do you apply the principles of God enunciated in the Scripture in the conditions of our time. And that requires constant interpretation and reinterpretation. The chief criticism, or one of the chief criticisms of my book by the kinds of people you've identified as critics, is that I see Joseph Smith as growing into his office as prophet. But I think he definitely grew into his office as prophet. He didn't know from age 14 on that he was the prophet of the Lord, and that was the end of it. I think he had to stumble around. He had to find his way. And that's part of the wonder of his life.
And so change being the only constant is something that we would all do well to sort of absorb into our perspectives.
Yeah. The word only, I think, distorts it a little. It's sort of like the Constitution, which the courts are always revising. But it doesn't mean the Constitution changes or is insignificant, that it's just putty in the hands of the judges. It's an anchor, and I think the Scriptures serve the same way. They're an anchor, and everything has to sort of grow out of them and be adjusted to the modern age.
But part of the genius, it seems to me like part of the genius of both the Constitution and Scriptures, and even the Book of Mormon, and I learned this in my American Heritage class at BYU, is that there was enough broad, I don't want to say vague, but enough general language to allow those documents to stretch, to conform to needed changes.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah.
And sometimes the Scriptures are minutely specific about go on a mission to such and such a place. But usually they are just kind of a perspective on the world.
Okay. So now let's turn to one of the hottest topics today, at least on the internet with regarding Mormonism, and that's treasure digging and folk magic. And if we can begin, let me just start. And that's that, you grow up in the church thinking that Joseph Smith was this all-American boy. That, yes, he talks about some mistakes that he made, but just like when President Hinckley stands up today and sort of does some self-deprecating humor, you really dismiss it as saying, no, this guy is about as close to Jesus as anyone will ever meet. He's close to perfection. That's how Joseph Smith was. He was that way as a boy. He was that way as a man. So we dismiss the mistakes that he clearly admits when he writes his own history. But then to extend that, we're taught that Ouija boards are bad and evil, that even face cards are bad. And so we have this real disposition against anything that might be considered dark or black, etc. And then on top of that, you really don't, you may grow up hearing a little bit about seer stones, but you don't hear a lot about it. You're certainly never taught, here's what they meant by seer stones. And then, the idea of treasure digging or water divining or, however that seems to be about as far as your perceptions of Joseph Smith as you could ever have. And then just to sort of cap this off, we're taught about Joseph Smith being brought into court at various times in his life, but we're never really told why he was brought into court. And we're taught about people who talked bad about Joseph Smith and his family, but we're never really taught, what were some of the things that they were doing that might have caused a bad reputation. And then just to sort of round it all out, when it comes to the Book of Mormon, and we'll actually cover the Book of Mormon later, but we're taught that what he used to translate was this formal Urim and Thummim type thing that scholars of prophets of Old Testament would have worn with a breastplate and some glasses, and then he's doing this translation. But you find out that this peepstone that he used, that we'll talk about, arches and makes its way all the way into his revealing of the Book of Mormon. So So this is the perception that one grows up with, and one just becomes completely shocked to learn about when he said he had weaknesses, what he meant, and what was the cause of a lot of this persecution and bad reputation, etc. So lay out for us what we should know about this issue.
Well, contrary to some of the things I was saying earlier, I think this is a case where the facts are the facts. He was put on trial for glass looking. He did have a seer stone. He did put it in his hat to translate the Book of Mormon. He put great value on that seer stone, and that's just the way it was.
How did it begin? Like, what do you have a sense for when these expeditions started happening? Who was involved? What they would do?
It's a little hard. There is this debate about when Joseph Sr., who is sort of the chief figure in all the treasure seeking, when he began this practice. Some people have said he did it in Vermont, which is altogether possible, but the evidence is weak. I think the chief starting point is 1822, when Joseph Smith, digging a well with Willard Chase, came across this stone that he believed had seer stone properties, and persuades Willard Chase to give it to him. And then he uses that all his life.
How would it have occurred to him that a stone could have special properties? Was that just because, people were having seer stones at the time, or folk magic and treasure digging was going on just generally within New England at that time period?
I think you've got it right there. It's part of their culture. Willard Chase wanted the stone back so he could use it as a seer stone. His sister Sally Chase used the seer stone to try to find the Book of Mormon plates. It was not a totally respectable culture, but it was, a strong undercurrent in Yankee culture all through that period.
And what would be a typical expedition in Yankee culture for the time period? What would people do?
Well, I don't know. The Hurlbut affidavits give various descriptions of magic rites, trying to find the treasure and then trying to get the treasure because it keeps receding out of sight. The trouble is, those accounts, you never know how much to trust them. Are they just jazzing them up to make it more dramatic, or is that how it really worked? But there was a sense that there might be guardians over these treasures who would try to prevent people from finding them and taking them away. So the angel Moroni fits into that pattern pretty well.
So totally disconnected from Joseph Smith, in New England in the early 1800s, people believed that there were buried treasures throughout the forests or mountains of America. They would go on expeditions to try and find them.
Yeah.
Sometimes they would use a stone or some type of device to help with the visionary things. They would see things. They would get together and maybe even feel like they were experiencing something unified and seeing some type of treasure in the ground, that maybe there was a guardian there, and they would usually never find the treasure.
Right.
Now, how could that be fun to go on an expedition to never find something?
It's a good question. I don't know, but they just perpetually went. I don't know of a single account of anyone actually turning up something that was of any value. But
so were they just bored or really superstitious?
Well, superstitious is a pejorative word. These are people, they're good Christians, who believe in the powers of the supernatural. If you go back to Puritanism, there's a lot of this kind of magic running through New England Puritanism. In the 17th century, it runs through Christianity at all levels, including educated people. So it's a very powerful and prevalent culture, magic. And Joseph Smith is sort of out on the edges of that and picks it up. We, of course, are offended by it. If he did things that were in the Bible or came out of Protestantism, then we would say, well, that's okay. That is our definition of what are legitimate sources for revelation and guidance. we would never say something coming out of Masonry or out of magic could be the starting point for a revelation. But I think that's a comment on our own parochialism as much as it is on Joseph Smith's situation. You know, there are a lot of church scholars who nobody love among them who love alchemy because it was an effort to raise the soul to a higher level. You're not just trying to turn base metals into precious metals. You're trying to turn a base self into a precious self. And so I don't. Maybe it's just because I've got accustomed to it, but I'm perfectly willing to say that that could be part of Joseph Smith's preparation for what otherwise was a totally fantastic thing, looking in the stone to translate a record. There's no precedence for that in his immediate environment. But looking in the stone to find lost objects was one way that he could have got ready for it.
So, in other words, God knew that through spiritual or inspired mechanical, somehow mechanical means, he was going to need to produce, the Book of Mormon and other revelations.
Yeah.
But the people didn't just do that out of their head. They did it through some type of process that involved the physical body. And so by allowing Joseph Smith to be exposed to a type of magic-based or spiritual-based process or ritual prepared him for being able to then produce an inspired work later.
Yeah, I think so. I think the same thing happens with Masonry and the Nauvoo period. We think that the translation of the Bible was the great source of his questions, and it was a very valuable source, but he got inspired from all sorts of things in his environment to think of, to ask questions and to get revelations.
It's a fair question how much of that is how revelation works, period. We like to think that revelation happens, even with prophets, by God saying, pull out your pencil, here's what you're going to dictate, or here's the revelation. And, anyone who knows about Spencer W. Kimball or David O. McKay's attempts to try and come up with the 1978 revelation, will know that it was much more nuanced and complicated than that, and involved real experience and conversations and thoughts and experiences that led to what we would then call a revelation. It was not pull out your pen, this is God, it's time to dictate, the 1978 revelation.
Well, I think that is our view of revelation, that it comes through the mind of a prophet in his language, which means in his culture. And so you've got to have enough in that culture to make it conceivable only to him. I'm a patriarch, and I believe that I'm able to give blessings to people that come out of my temperament and my experience. Another patriarch with a different set of experiences could probably give another kind of blessing to them. There isn't just one way of doing things. It all is coming through the person who speaks God and has the imprint of that person's background on what is said.
So in other words, you can't reveal with words you don't have, and you can't grapple with experiences you haven't dealt with in your life.
I'd say so. I'm not saying you can't broaden your views a lot, that you're really restricted, because the revelations were some pretty remarkable things. I think the Book of Mormon is a fabulous story, and despite what all the critics say, I still don't see you get that whole book out of Joseph Smith's immediate environment. So you can get beyond to a certain extent, but you're still tethered to your own culture.
Right. So real quick, so Joseph started doing these expeditions regularly?
Well, it's hard to tell. He gets to Searstone in 1822, and it sounds like the Hurlbut affidavits are talking about thereafter, in the next few years. Then in 1826, there's this trial where Joseph Sr. says in a very dramatic and powerful statement that we have used this boy's gifts for base purposes, seeking wealth, rather than the higher purposes of God. So I think that's sort of the high point of Smith family money digging. And then it's going to run downhill. Now, Dan Vogel comes up with all sorts of examples of money digging after that time, and I would not deny that it might have happened, because you don't cut things off immediately usually. But it's much thinner evidence. It's not nearly as persuasive, and so I think there was a sort of a 4-year period, and then it tapered off pretty readily.
And I think I remember from your Beginnings of Early Mormonism book that it may have even been that Joseph at times wanted to stop, but his dad sometimes pressured him to keep going.
Well, yeah, I do think that his father was the enthusiast, not Joseph. He was pressing him into his service, and there's little pieces of evidence to show that. Not that Joseph thought it was all wrong. You know, the Lord never repudiated money digging as an art. He repudiated doing these things for wealth, and it was the greed of the money diggers that he was to get away from. And so, you know, when he goes off to Salem, when was that, 37, I think, fall of 37, or 36, he's thinking he's going to find treasure in the basement of a house. So it kept sort of reasserting itself over the years, but it's a minor theme after that, after 1826.
After 1826. Now that's interesting, because one of the things that, one of the basic questions to ask, I think, in just understanding the narrative is, how did Joseph meet Emma? And tell me how much of the story I have right. That there's a man named Josiah Stoll who heard that Joseph had some special powers or gifts. He had reason to believe that there was a treasure mine, a silver mine in Pennsylvania, and so he said, Joseph, come with me. I need you to help me find this treasure mine. And while Joseph and Josiah Stoll were in Pennsylvania, somehow they connected with the Hale family, and I don't even know if they took board with the Hales, but that's how Joseph met Emma Hale.
Yep.
And as I recall reading Von Brody's book, it sounds like Joseph even took Isaac Hale with them as they went to find the silver mine, and Joseph leads them to the place of the silver mine and then says, "Oh, I'm sorry, it's too far down, we can't get it." And that was what made Isaac Hale say, "This guy's a kook, he's a fraud." And that's why he wouldn't let Joseph marry Emma, and that's why Joseph and Emma had to elope.
Yeah.
Am I fair, or did I miss something there, or is that true?
Well, it's always a question of the reliability of the evidence. It is true that he boarded with the Smiths, with the Hales, got to know Emma, and that Isaac was sort of involved in this. His name appears on some of the documents those miners were working on, so he's involved. Then he does become disillusioned. Whether or not it was from this experience at the treasure mine, that's the part that isn't really well worked out, or the evidence isn't all that good. It's possible, but I'm not so sure of it. But it is a fact that Isaac Hale was very critical of Joseph Smith after that time.
And this is post 1826, right? So I mean, this is the residue that you talk about. He's still doing it some, right? No. This is not post 1826. The trial occurs after this incident. Oh.
They digging in November of 1825
in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania.
Okay. The trial is, I think, the spring of 1826, as he goes back down to work for Josiah Stoll, and Josiah Stoll's nephew or something like that brings this suit against Joseph. So it's after that fact.
And some have tried to claim that he brought him along to dig, as in with the shovel. And you would say that's not likely his main purpose in going, right?
To bring Isaac Hale along?
No. That Josiah Stoll brought some have tried to discredit this trip to Pennsylvania as Josiah Stoll bringing Joseph along to dig with his shovel. He needed hands to dig holes.
Well, I think he did that, but he doesn't bring Joseph down from Palmyra for that reason. It's because he's got this gift. That's what he's interested in.
And I bet you would say that if the critics are going to, disparage Joseph Smith, they're going to have to answer the question as to why his father and other members of the community continued to believe that he had a power. Is that true? Because even Josiah Stoll, after the trial, maintained that Joseph Smith had power, even though he wasn't able to find treasure. Is that right?
Yeah, Josiah Stoll, at the trial, testified that he believed Joseph Smith had a real gift. So, and Josiah Stoll joins the church and so on. So his faith in Joseph never wavers.
This program has been a production of Mormon Stories Podcast. To comment on this episode or to peruse the archives of past episodes, please visit us online at mormonstories.org. Also, please consider supporting Mormon Stories Podcast by making a contribution today, or by voting for this episode at dig.com and sustained.org. Thanks again for listening.